In popular imagination, the Battle of the Atlantic tends to be overlooked compared to the great battles of the Pacific. A shame, really, because some of the actions in the Atlantic deserve a second look, such as that of USS Borie. This is one of the more interesting ones to come from the Battle of the Atlantic. After all, how often does ramming another ship end with you perched on top of your target? How often did battles between destroyers and U-boats come down to shotguns and submachine guns? Not often at all. Before we can talk about that, however, I'll go over Borie's career up to that final battle. Very briefly in this case. I will also note before moving forward that my voice is kind of shot at the moment. You can probably tell that just listening to it. I want to give that forewarning before we move on. The ship that became USS Borie was laid down on April 30th, 1919. As a Clemson-class destroyer, she displaced 1,234 tons, which let her carry 4 4-inch guns. 1 on the bow, 1 on an aft gunhouse, and 2 on either side of the funnel amidships, as well as 12 21-inch torpedoes and 4 triple launchers, with 2 on either side of the ship. The destroyer also carried 2 depth charge racks on her stern for use against submarines. With a speed of 35 knots on 26,500 shaft horsepower, Borie was also quite fast for 1919. With those details out of the way, USS Borie was launched on October 4th, 1919, and commissioned on March 24th, 1920. By this point, the Great American Fleet expansion was largely unnecessary. Many of the 4-stackers, Clemson or Wicks, were placed in reserve almost immediately after entering the water. In a time of peace, there simply wasn't a need for hundreds of identical destroyers. And this was before the great post-war fire sale of the Fletchers after the Second World War. Borie was fortunate, in a way, in that she actually got to see some use, although that use was fairly standard for the time. Borie served from Turkey to the Asiatic Fleet and everywhere in between during the interwar years. She would see stints in the Asiatic Fleet and the Battle Fleet, as well as the Atlantic Fleet. If there was an American fleet, Borie served in it. It's just that her service was training duty with little to write home about. Kind of standard, yes, but not exciting. In late 1939, however, Borie returned to the Atlantic to join the Neutrality Patrol, where she would remain until the outbreak of war against the Axis powers. Now, as an old 4-stacker, Borie was not sent to the Pacific. She was used for patrol duty in the Caribbean, as German U-boats grew ever bolder in their actions off the United States coast. This still did not see much of note, at least at first. Borie didn't run into any exciting battles, with her biggest excitement coming in rescuing survivors of US-AT Merrimack on June 15, 1942. By no means is this a bad thing. It meant she was doing her job in keeping American waters safe from German attack. It was just fairly monotonous service. So monotonous, in fact, that Borie was pulled off that service in November of 1942. The old destroyer was refit in New Orleans to bring her more up to date, and more in line with a U-boat hunting mission. She received a surface search radar, a technology that her designers could hardly have imagined in the 1910s. As well as this, the old destroyer began to pick up 20mm cannon. 2 at first, although a later refit in 1943 increased the number to 6. To carry these guns, Borie lost 2 of her 222 torpedo mounts, which, fair enough, those weren't going to get much use against submarines anyway. Regardless, with radar and new light weaponry, Borie returned to service. At first, this was much the same as it had been before the refit. She escorted a convoy to Brazil in early 1943. and then she was assigned to escort a convoy to Morocco in May of 1943. This would prove to be the final convoy that USS Borie ever escorted. Alongside her sisters, USS Gulf and USS Borie, the old destroyer joined an anti-submarine group led by USS Card, a Bogue-class escort carrier, one of many of her type. Also a ship that needs a video of her own, at least at some point. For now, however, let's focus on Borie. The old destroyer would spend much of summer 1943 operating with her sisters and USS Card. From June through October of 1943, Borie went on 4 patrols. 3 of these were a success, sinking U-boats and protecting Allied shipping between the United States and North Africa. Such a success, in fact, that between those patrols and the final battle, Borie's task group earned a Presidential Unit Citation. Those aren't given out easily. That said, though, we've reached the time for Borie's final battle. On the night of October 31st, 1943, Borie caught the submarine U-256 on the surface with her radar. With metaphorical blood in the water, the old four-stacker closed in. To the credit of the German crew, they were quick to crash dive, even caught by surprise. Not that it helped much. Borie's crew proved quite good with their depth charges, forcing U-256 back to the surface after 2 runs. This after their sonar was temporarily knocked out, before 10 minutes of frantic work brought it back online. While the U-boat managed to submerge again, the damage done to her was severe. So severe that the oil slick left behind was taken as a successful attack by Borie's crew after a 3rd depth charge run. As it turned out, the Germans managed to limp home. Nonetheless, Borie's captain, Charles Hutchins, was not content. He radioed in, "Scratch 1 pig boat 11 miles south of your position. Am searching for more," and proceeded to do just that. Around 2 a.m. on November 1st, Borie got another radar contact. This submarine would prove a bit more of a challenge. Under the aggressive command of her captain, the youngest destroyer skipper in the Navy, Borie charged towards the enemy. For those wondering, Hutchins was only 30 years old at the time. In spite of losing radar contact at 2,800 yards, the destroyer had her nose to the target. Her sonar quickly picked up the German boat, allowing Borie to launch depth charges. The seas were quite rough at that point, with 15-foot waves and high winds. I can only imagine how miserable being in a Clemson in that kind of weather would have been. This wasn't a class known for being fun in a calm sea, let alone that kind of stormy weather. Borie's crew seemed to have hardly noticed as they depth charged the Germans. Now, I could say their accurate fire continued here, but that would be less fun. What actually happened was Borie's depth charge racks malfunctioning, dumping her entire load of stern depth charges in one go. This succeeded in lifting the destroyer's stern out of the water and drove the German U-boat to the surface. The U-boat, U-405, came up within 400 yards of Borie. Point-blank range for all intents and purposes. Borie's radar gave a bearing, and her searchlight sprang to life. Her guns immediately opened fire whenever they had a good angle. Both the 4-inch main battery and the new 20mm cannon. The 2 ships were so close to each other that Borie's crew could make out the insignia on the U-boat's conning tower. Now, in most any other surface action, Borie would have been outmatched. She was old and obsolescent. Her main battery of 4-inch guns was quite light by the standards of Second World War destroyers. Against a U-boat on the surface, however, it was quite sufficient. Brutally so. The first salvo from the 4-inch guns blasted U-405's deck gun clean off the submarine. The 20mm guns, meanwhile, blasted the German conning tower. Aside from a few 20mm rounds of their own, The U-boat was completely unable to fire back. When the crew tried, they were cut down by Borie. As this was happening, the U-boat frantically tried to get away. She could turn better than the notoriously fickle four-stacker, but Borie managed to stay right with the Germans. Hutchins kept his destroyer next to the U-boat, continuing to pound her. At one point, the Germans might have been trying to surrender. They shot off flares, and a sailor on the conning tower waved his arms at the Americans. Hutchins certainly took this as an attempt to surrender and ordered his crew to cease fire. Unfortunately, as happens in the fog of war, mistakes were made. One of the gun captains on Borie had removed his headphones and didn't hear the ceasefire order. His gun promptly, blew the German sailor's head away. The fight continued at that point, as you could expect. Things were soon to change, however, as Hutchins grew impatient. In spite of his fine seamanship, the U-boat was more agile, and he couldn't know for sure if it was damaged to the point where it couldn't submerge. As such, he gave a classic order: stand by for a ram. USS Borie, working up to 25 knots, rammed into the starboard side of U-405. Unfortunately for all involved, this was not a clean ramming. Remember those 15-foot waves that I mentioned earlier? One of those rose up at the very last moment and lifted Borie up. Instead of slicing into the side of U-405, Borie's bow ended up wedged on top of the U-boat. Stuck at a 30-degree angle, the destroyer and U-boats were locked together for 10 minutes. Borie's crew had drilled for a similar circumstance in a U-boat ramming their port side as recently as October 27th. They leapt into action without any orders, grabbing every weapon they could find: Thompsons, shotguns, pistols, and even a flare gun at one point. While the gun crews tried to work their weapons, the rest of the crew, engineers aside, opened fire. The Germans did much the same from open hatches. However, every time the German crew tried to man a gun, he was cut down. In most cases, this was done by Borie's own guns and gun crews, or the motley collection of firearms her remaining crew gathered. In at least 3 cases, it was by more unique means. First, a fireman first class, David Southwick, threw a knife at a German sailor. This was from less than 10 yards, and killed the German. In the second incident, another of Borie's crew, Walter Cruz, threw a 4-inch shell casing, knocking a German sailor into the water. In the final case, another crewman, who wasn't named, fired a flare pistol, killing a German with a chest shot. Through all of this, Borie's engineers did the best they could to keep the ship afloat. Her old plates were buckling, and the stress of the ram was killing the destroyer. It buckled her entire port side and flooded her forward engine room. In an act of bravery, her engineers and damage control team kept that engine room running, even in neck-deep water. Eventually, however, these ships broke apart. The U-boat was still capable of outmaneuvering Borie and attempted to use her stern torpedo tube. To counter this, Hutchins wisely shut off the destroyer's searchlight. The goal was to avoid a torpedo, but also to trick U-405 into trying to escape. And it worked. Borie worked up to 27 knots in spite of her damage, and lit up the U-boat for a final time. U-405 tried to ram the destroyer in a mirror of the earlier action, but Hutchins avoided the attempt. Borie dropped more depth charges and fired more shells until U-405 finally surrendered. It just took a 4-inch shell blasting her starboard exhaust to pieces to convince the Germans to do so. In any case, 15 or so of the U-boat's crew made it into life rafts as the submarine sank. U-405 slipped beneath the waves just before 3 a.m. on November 1st, 1943. The crew would, unfortunately, never be rescued. It's hard to say it isn't their own fault in the event. Borie had moved to pick up German survivors, but they continued to fire flares and star shells from their life rafts. For his part, Hutchins assumed it was a distress signal. And maybe it was, from a certain point of view. Then another star shell came up in the distance, followed by a torpedo nearly hitting Borie. U-405's crew had been signaling another surface U-boat lurking nearby. With his destroyer already suffering, Hutchins made the decision to leave. He had to sail around the German rafts, leaving the survivors behind. Whoever that other U-boat was, it never picked up the survivors either. In this final act of defiance, U-405 survivors doomed themselves. As for Borie, the destroyer sailed off at 10 knots. Her damage was severe and arguably fatal. Her crew fought valiantly to keep their destroyer afloat. They threw everything overboard short of the main battery, and even then they only left 10 shells per gun. The crew pumped out as much water as they could, but they couldn't fight the rising tides. Eventually, trailing oil and with the waves climbing to 20 feet, Hutchins had to order abandoned ship. Borie's communications officer had used lighter fluid and alcohol from a torpedo to get her radio working and called for help. USS Gulf and USS Borie arrived and took off Borie's crew on the night of November 1st, 1943. During the engagement with U-405, none of Borie's crew died. Several were wounded, but none were killed. In the evacuation of the foundering destroyer, 3 officers and 24 men unfortunately drowned. It's a sad end to what had been a successful action, at least up to that point. Nonetheless, 125 men and 4 officers were rescued. USS Borie, meanwhile, stubbornly remained afloat into the next morning. It took the combined efforts of her sister ships and aircraft from USS Card to finally sink the stubborn destroyer on November 2nd, 1943. Her story is one that deserves remembering from start to finish. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.